Hi and welcome to Frontline City Church's YouTube channel. We are a Stirling-based Assemblies of God church based right in the heart of Scotland with the goal of making disciples of Jesus who are spiritually robust, powerful and strong. We hope that you enjoyed today's message, and if you would like to hear more from us, please feel free to check out our website, which is linked in the description below.
All right, we've been looking at the subject of the will of God, and as I said to you at the beginning, that the will of God is in this case of where it's extremely complicated, but at the same time it's quite simple. And one of the things that we're looking at is the fact that the different things that the will of God was not. We looked at that. That's on one of our videos, I think the first one. And then as we go on, we've looked at what the will of God is, and we've tackled that to a certain extent. We looked at it last week and went in depth about the fact that the will of God, this is the will of God, that you abstain from all fornication and that you would be sanctified. All that would take place there in the giving of thanks. We also looked at the concept that the will of God is perfect, good and acceptable, that we prove the will of God, that it's something that can be tested, and it's something which is quite exciting. One of the things that we started off by saying is that unless you're in gross sin or you have literally said no to the revealed will of God in your life, the general rule of thumb, I suppose is the best way of putting it, is that you're in the will of God right now. We're going to talk about that a little bit more as we go on. And I'm going to move this chair because it's squeaking on the back wall. So you'll have to edit that out as well now, Sophie. But the whole thing is that the will of God is something which isn't complicated. It's something that, and I entitled this whole message, How the Will of God Finds Us. And I've done that because instead of it being this constant, I think I can, striving for the will of God, it's a matter of being in a relaxed position to be able to let the will of God find us and yield to it and run with it. And you'll find that this is an important word, yield. Yield is an interesting word. It doesn't just mean sit there and do nothing. It actually means to assist, to come alongside and assist. In other words, if you're going to yield, it means that you yield to where the direction's taking you. And we'll be looking at a few of those things today. So I want to look at this in that light. A couple of things I want to say about the will of God. One is that the will of God is relational. You see that when Jesus in Matthew 3, I think it is, they come to him and they say, Jesus, your mother and brothers are outside and they want to talk to you. And he says something like, he says, all they that do the will of the Father are my mother and brother, and so on. So he's talking about being in the will of God, doing the will of God, brings us into a depth of relationship which is like family. So the will of God is important for us as family of God to move in that. And the other one that I wanted to say, and just rounding off last week's, was the fact that the will of God is also personal. Right? Now, what I mean by that is that in John chapter 20, I think it is, you see there that Jesus is talking to Peter, and Peter is telling Peter what's going to happen to him, that he, to put it in a nutshell, was going to be crucified, carried away and crucified, and so on. And then he says, what about this guy? And what about John? What about John? What's going to happen to him? And Jesus says, don't worry about what I will for John. You just worry about what I'm doing for you. And I think that one of the things about the will of God is that sometimes we can get to the place where we worry about what God's will is for everybody else, when really we need to be concerned with what God's speaking to us and allowing that to happen. So that means that my responsibility isn't so much to find out what God's will is for you, but to allow the will of God to find me and give myself to it. Okay? So that's a personal side of it. But I want to talk to you today in regards to the cost of the will of God. But the first one is that we've talked about this concept of a thing called comportment. Now, we've learning English in this house like we've never learnt it before. Svetlana, who is our special guest, is learning English, and we've discovered words and tenses that we never even knew existed in English. And this is the word I found out the other day called comportment. And comportment basically means all to do with character and nature and lifestyle within it. So the first compartment of the will of God is that area of comportment, which is to do with character, your sanctification, that you abstain from fornication, that you live in the will of God, that you have this aspect of being obedient to the will of God, and so on. Okay, so you got this character side of it. But I also want to talk about the other side, which I'm calling the vocational and directional will. Vocational and directional will. And I want to share some personal mistakes that I've made, especially in my early days as a Christian. Okay, to give you a bit of an understanding of, number one, the grace of God. Even though I made mistakes, the grace of God still led me. But on the other side of it, the heartaches that I could have saved myself had I understood this back then. Okay, so number one, the vocational will of God. That's a really interesting subject, and we're going to talk about that in different levels. But the first one is, you got Paul and Peter and so on that talk about called by the will of God to be an apostle. Paul, you'll see that all the time in his opening statements, called by the will of God to be an apostle, remember? So his vocation was very clearly within the will of God to be an apostle. That was his calling. Okay, so the vocation sometimes is very specific. Some people feel that they're called to be pastors. Some people feel they're called to be evangelists, teachers, apostles, prophets, and so on. So there's definitely a vocational call within the giftings of the Spirit that way. But there's others that are called to be elders, deacons, and others that are called just to be a part of the members of the body of Christ in a local church. But there's also this other vocational aspect which I think is very important, because we're called to be people within the community. Let's have a look at a chapter, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and we see here Paul teaching some very interesting concepts that the church in many ways has forgotten, I think, in some ways. If we pick it up in verse 7, 1 Corinthians 7:17, he said, only let the person lead that life that is assigned to him, to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Okay, so that's not the verse I'm looking for. Okay. Oh, all right, we'll keep reading because it leads into the verses there. Okay. Was anyone at any time already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. For neither circumcision counts for anything nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commands of God. Each one of you should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who is called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freed man of the Lord. Likewise, he who is free is also called a bondservant of Christ. We are bought with a price. Do not become bondservants of men. So, brethren, in whatever condition you were called, let him remain with God. So, what's he trying to say there? As far as a vocational call, the calling, where we were when we were saved, what we were doing when we were saved, you keep doing it. Okay? So that if the will of God is that you are called into something else, then he will bring that to pass. He will show you and lead it. My early days, I got saved when, in 1976, I got saved. I was 18 years of age, and I got saved in November of 1976. I moved out west to a country town called Dubbo, which is about 4 hours outside of Sydney. And I was working there as a mechanic, working in transmissions and so on. But I felt this stirring and this calling on my life. Now let me tell you, to my shame, I did everything in my power to get out of work so that I could fulfill this call to be a pastor, as I interpret it, okay? And I can tell you, and if you knew the people who were around me, they would know. My catch cry was, and I worked in the mechanical industry, I repaired transmissions, automatic transmissions, and so on, right? My catchphrase was, I'd come home from work and I'd say, I hate transmissions. I hate working as a mechanic. I hate it. And my attitude stank. I was just terrible. And I got to the place where I said, I'm called for ministry. So I resigned my job, and believe it or not, I ran out of money pretty quickly, and I ended up doing part-time or on-call work for the same place I retired from. I resigned from, and so on. And so I was forced back into it. Now here's the interesting thing was that God was still working his plans out. My old pastor from Sydney had moved to a place called Mudgee. I'd met this girl who was in Mudgee by the name of Kerry, became interested. Anyway, before long, I was asked to go to that town to be an assistant pastor, not knowing that the pastor was very ill. He died in the November, and I became the pastor 6 years after I was saved of that church in Mudgee. And God, through all my fumblings and stumblings and attitude changes and everything, brought about the past what it was that God wanted me to do. Okay, now what I'm trying to say is that I've put myself through an enormous amount of heartache by not surrendering to the will of God for my life at that time. Do you understand? My concept was so narrow, right? I was that narrow-minded I could look through a keyhole with both eyes. I was just so narrow-minded in it that the concept of the will of God had to be ministry, because I had to call a ministry on my life. I'm not denying that. That's what I've done for the last 40 years. But the problem was that I could not see that the will of God was for me to be in this other place and learn people skills, to learn management and stuff like that in this other place, because I was so focused, and my attitude was, I hate transmissions. You talk to any of my mates at that time, they would say, oh no, don't tell us you hate transmissions. Yeah, I hate them, you know. And I thought, I look back on my shame now and I hang my head and I go, oh God, why did I do that? Why did I do that? I should have just yielded to it and let this thing, could have saved myself heartache. But the grace of God works and brought it about, and the next thing you know, I was in ministry exactly November 1982. And then we were married into December 1982. So Kerry's got no excuse. She married a pastor. So there you go. So that's one of the things that I have, to my shame. And it's like we have this whole thing. Even when we became pastors, there was this aspect where I've been so thick that I haven't really been quick to learn to respond to the will of God. I think of so many aspects. One of them was India. We had a guy come through and he said to us, look, I go to India every year, would you like to come with us? My attitude was, nah, not interested. Don't want to go to India, whatever. Kerry had always wanted to go to another country with another culture. And so she said, yeah, well, to go. And I go, I'm not interested in everything. And this guy confronted me between the eyes. He said, what is wrong with you? What are you so scared of? And of course, being a mate, being a man, an Australian male, I said, I'm not scared of anything. And so we went. And I remember we were so, we don't know, Kerry particularly prayed that there would be a sign that we are supposed to go. And we lived in a country town, Midwest New South Wales, out in the beginning of the outback area there. And that next Sunday in our church came an Indian lady dressed in a sari, which doesn't happen in the country New South Wales, and came to our church and came from the very region in which we were supposed to go. So I sort of realised that maybe God was trying to say something. Now here's the interesting thing. That was the will of God, because we went back to India, or I went back to India 22 times, and just recently, a couple of years ago. And the fruit is just absolutely staggering of what God used us in that country. And I'm trying to say here that the directional will of God, I believe, comes to us when we have surrendered ourselves to the Lord. Okay, I want to talk about that today, about the surrender that takes place. I could tell you about working with the Aboriginal people up in the north of New South Wales. Again, I was so thick. Kerry's parents, of all things, were saying to us, we need to be involved in Aboriginal work. And they go, not interested in the slightest. But I'd made a decision in our church that we would not get involved with any missional work unless we set our feet upon there and saw what was going on. Because, as you know, sometimes you're sending money to missionaries and they're not doing what they're supposed to do. So I committed myself that if we were going to do this thing to the missions, I had to go and see what was going on. So, cut a long story short, again, begrudgingly, I said yes and went up to the northern area of Australia and worked with the Aboriginals, and I don't know how many times, I went 7 or 8 times, and just absolutely loved it, became a very special friend with the missionary, we became very close friends, and so on and so on. And I could tell you about Romania, I could tell you about working with the gypsies, I could talk about so many things. I've been so thick. It's not something that comes from my own ability to create these things. But what I'm trying to say is that in the heart of surrender, God can lead you even though you don't see it into the will of God. You following what I'm saying? That it's not necessarily, I used to always think, and maybe some of you were taught this, that the will of God and the call of God is always driven by your desire. Well, sometimes that's correct, but I've discovered that God is able to change your desire very quickly. When you yield to Him, the amazement is how it can change. Look, Paul talks about this, about the vocational call, but he also talks about the directional call. He says there to the Romans, he says, I want to come to you in the will of God that I may impart some spiritual blessing. Right? And then he talks about at the end of the chapter, he says the same thing again. He says, I really long that I can come to you in the will of God. And so there is directional. Once you get the compartment, that's that new word we learnt, once we get the character and the nature and the attitudinal will in place, and we surrender to the Lord, and then we surrender to the vocation that He gives us, no matter where we are, what we're doing at that time, we surrender to that, and then God is able to lead us directionally into where He wants to take us. And I know there's people in this room that if I was to ask them, they could give you the same story of how God came to them, spoke to them, and then gave them all these things to bring them to another country or to take them to another situation or location. And so it goes. But you see, Paul lived that way, and he decided he was going to go into Asia, and as he's about to go, he has a dream and realizes that that's not where he's supposed to go. He was a man from Macedonia who appears to him in a dream and says, come to Macedonia and help us. He wakes up the next morning and says, that's God redirecting us. We're not going to that way. We're going down to Macedonia. And then there's the Philippine church that takes place, and there's the great revival thing that takes place there. And we have the great epistles and so on from his being obedient to the leading and direction of the Lord. So, how does all this take place? It comes out of this point of surrender. It comes out of this cost, if I could use that term, of surrender. It's I'm calling it the cost of the will of God, the cost of these things that comes to us. Okay? It's something which is, dropping everything here. It's something which is extremely important, because it's in that vocational will that we find that the Spirit of God wants to give us something that leads us and guides us and takes us in to his eternal purpose for our life. Now, he uses an interesting word. He uses this word, bondservant. If we look at Ephesians 6, it is. He says, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. Now, he's using that in the scriptural context of the day in which they lived. He's saying, if you're a bondservant, if you're a slave, that's the actual word. It's douros is the Greek word. If you're a slave, then just work as you do for your master as you would unto the Lord. That's his statement, is there. And he's saying, don't just do it as eye service, but actually do it as unto the Lord. But Paul's relating this now to the concept of us being a bondservant of Christ. Now, let me just give you a little definition of what this word means, because it's extremely important to get the concept of it, because douros is the most common word that's used for slave in the New Testament. It's designated to one who was born into this condition of slavery, one bound to his master as his slave, one who is in a permanent relationship to his master, which relationship could only be broken by death, one whose will was swallowed up in the will of his master, one who served his master even to the extent of his own, disregarded his own interest. The word is used in the first century as a designation of a class of slaves that represented the most abject servile condition. Word is taken over into the New Testament to designate a sinner as a slave. It also is used to speak of a believer as a bondservant to the Lord Jesus. Okay, so the actual word that Paul is using there in regards to being a bondservant according to the will of God is a very, very severe word. It's not just an employee, it's actually a slave. It's someone who has no rights. Now, we look at it in our 21st century Western eyes and we think, oh, abhor, horror, that's terrible, what a place. But the first century church in that world, slaves and slavery was absolutely rife throughout all the nations. The Jews had slaves, they had slaves within their own rights, there were slaves within the Roman Empire and that sort of thing. And so within that comes this injection of salvation and Christianity, and in that he injects Christian faith into the midst of those circumstances. We don't see a abolition movement rise up in the first century. We don't see that thing happening. In fact, if you look at Philemon, we see Paul encourages the runaway slave to come back to the master, encourages the master to treat him like a Christian brother, and we see that this was not the major issue. The issue was brotherly love, was the issue of submission to one another. And so when we come into this area of the will of God and this bondservant, we are now talking about this surrendering our will unconditionally to the will of God. It's that unconditional bondservant will. The story, of course, relates to in the Old Testament where someone was sold in slavery. They were in slavery, and while they were in slavery they get married and they have children and so on. And here's the ironical thing that people and history doesn't seem to tell us, is that sometimes the slave masters were very good. The slave masters actually gave the slaves a great life. Although they surrendered to the will of the master and served the master gave them a great life. And it's quite possible that Luke, the guy who wrote the book of Luke and Acts, as more than like could have been a slave who was trained to be a doctor within the house of Theophilus. That's one theory of what could have taken place there. So there was this aspect in which masters took their slaves and made them very, very secure and welcome. There's other cases where Christians went into the slave markets, bought slaves, and then just said, go free, released them. These people went off and then they got captured again and wound up being resold on the slave market. So we find that in God's wisdom, he's saying, bring Christianity. If you're a master, treat your slaves correctly. If you're a slave, treat your master correctly and allow God to sort all this out. And so when he's talking about that, in the Old Testament, there would come this time when a slave had a choice to go free, and if he chose, he could go free, or he could come back to his master and put his ear against the doorpost, and they get an awl and they would punch a hole through it into there. And at that time he would say, I love my master, I love my wife, I love my children, I will not go free. That meant that he was forever a bond servant or a bond slave to his master. And so that's what Paul's saying. He's saying there, I was a bond servant to sin, I was a bond servant to the devil, I was a bond servant to religion. Jesus, you confronted me, called me on the road to Damascus, and I love Paul's answer. When he's confronted, he says, who are you? And Jesus says to him, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. What was Paul's response? What is it you want me to do, Lord? Whatever it is. He sold himself to the Lord in that sense of being a bondservant again. He knew what it was. So when we are talking about the will of God directionally, the will of God vocationally, I believe that it's out of this attitude of a bondservant that we actually find that God leads us and guides us. I did not know that. By the grace of God, he led me into his will, but I gave myself a whole heartache of years of frustration and crying out to God for something that he was going to do anyway, but I was just in a terrible place. The word surrender actually means to give something of yours over to someone else, because even though you've been forced to, or it was necessary, or you've stopped fighting and now you have admitted defeat. And let me tell you, that's what coming to Christ is all about. You stop fighting, you admit that you were defeated, and then you surrender your will to his will to be done. Now, I would love to be able to say, you say that prayer once and that's the end of it. But it's a continual thing in our lives. Every time something comes up, there is that aspect that's there. You see, if Jesus had to pray it, not my will, but your will be done. Not my will, but your will be done. When he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, he says, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. Guys, can I teach you something which I've learnt, I'm trying to learn? There is these nevertheless moments that we have to live with. What do I mean by that? There is times when everything within me wants to do the opposite. And I've got to say, but nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. And I believe that the key to walking in the will of God is not strength of power and strength of will, but it's a nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. It's that bondservant that yields to the Lord, that says, nevertheless, not what I want, what you want. It's not my comfort. It's important. That's important. It's your one. It's that Jesus, even, it says there that he, through the eternal Spirit, offered him life up. He needed the power of the Holy Spirit even to yield himself to that nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. Let me tell you what happens when we do this surrender. When we do this incredible surrendering to the Lord, when we do this, nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done, and that becomes the catchphrase. Instead of I hate transmissions, I should have been saying, nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done, and living through it. Remember, I just went to my pastor once and I said, I'm sick of this, I'm frustrated. I said, how can this? And he said, doing menial things and just a job can be the will of God for your life. I said, no. I argued with him. I know it's hard to believe that I would argue with a pastor, but I did. And like that, and he just shook his head and sort of said, you'll find out. And he was right. He was right, unfortunately. Or fortunately, he was right, should I say. But it's at that place where we become this bondservant, that this nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. Okay? The concept of being in the workplace, being in the will of God, I'm digressing a little bit here, but I think that if we can grab a hold of this, if the church can grab a hold of this, I think that we will have, God will raise Christians up within the marketplace to begin to have influence in areas where we have lost influence. I think we will find people rise in areas of influence. Okay? We could talk forever on that, but I just really sensed that in my spirit this morning as I was thinking over these things, and how that we need to see again Christians that say, nevertheless, wherever I am, I'm going to excel. Here's the stupid thing about me, okay? I'd love to tell you something stupid about someone else, but I can't think of anything. Something stupid about me was that when I was in this workplace, where I hate transmissions, I don't want to be here and ever. Guess what? I kept on advancing. They took me from there to from just being a worker in the thing to a foreman, and then from a foreman to a relieving manager. They sent me to different places to relieve and to take over the place when the manager was away. You see, even when I was in a position of I hate transmissions, God was still advancing me and making me influential within the workplace. You see, how thick can I get? So stupid. And even when I left, they came back and asked me would I do part-time work for them. And I got more doing part-time than I did. Anyway, it's another story. So, people in the workplace can be in the slap bang of the will of God. I think of that story of Naaman. Here's Naaman. He was a mighty man, but he had leprosy, remember? And it says there that he couldn't get a cure. He didn't know what to do. He's a mighty man, but he had leprosy. And one day, this servant girl who had been captured from Israel and brought there as a slave to work in Naaman's house, she's there one day and she says to the wife, oh, that Naaman, my master, would go to Israel, for there is a prophet in Israel that will heal him of his leprosy. So she goes and tells Naaman. Naaman gets on his high horse and off he goes to there. And you know the story. He winds up having to humble himself and gets healed, dips himself in the water 7 times and is healed. Why? Because someone who was a captive was in the will of God, and the history tells us that it changed that nation for a century or so, whatever that was. So here's this factor of the surrendering to the will of God no matter where you are. Okay, that 1 Corinthians 7 is a very important thing. Okay, let me just give you 4 things here that I think happen when we surrender. It changes me. He changes me first and does a work in me. I've seen people do a false surrender in the hope that when they surrender, all their circumstances change. I've discovered that the surrendering doesn't change my circumstances. First thing it does, it changes me. And in that place, I see things differently. It changes me, and I'm able to rejoice in the fact that God has got me there. It's a continued experience of having to take step after step of surrender and yielding, no matter what the circumstance. It's by His grace. It's the only way it can happen, is by His grace. And that's what surrender does. Lord, I surrender, knowing that your grace is sufficient for me. And I talked about this a second ago, the power of the nevertheless. Nevertheless, these things. So, to be in the will of God, I'm calling it not Pentecost, but Plentecost. It costs us everything, but the yielding of it brings an incredible amount of surrender. Look, there's an old song that a guy called, I can't even think of his name now, called Got to Serve Somebody. What's his name?
Bob Dylan.
Bob Dylan wrote. And he just does this incredible contrast. And the chorus is, it may be the devil, but it better be the Lord, but you got to serve somebody. And I found that that's true. If I'm serving myself, I'm really not serving me, I'm serving the will of someone else. If I'm serving the will of God, then that is the answer. The concept that I believe the New Testament presents to us, and it's given to us in little ways, like the area of that Jesus is the King of Kings. It's in areas like that we, through the gift of righteousness, shall reign in life. And it's talking about this concept of those days of a vassal king. The concept of a vassal king was a major king would come through and take over an area or take over a country. And what he would then do is the king that was there would surrender, would yield to the will of the new king. And what would then happen is that that king would become what they call a vassal king. He was a king under another king. So he ruled and reigned in his kingdom still, but under the rule and reign of a greater king. Okay? So when I'm talking about giving up your will, yielding to the will of God, it's not that you then just live a life of vegetation and you're doing nothing. You're still a king. You're still ruling and reigning in life, but you submitted yourself under this other king. The word submit doesn't mean to be dominated and having been groveling into the dirt. It actually means to set in array under. It means that everything I do in the light of the fact that he is my king over me. And as we make plans, he has the right to change and to do those different things. Circumstances change, situations change, but the sooner I surrender to him, become that bondservant, not my will but your will be done, that yielding to him, what happens is that the will of God begins to take place quicker and becomes more noticeable than I saw it. I didn't see it when I was younger, and fought against it, but now I realise that the answer is surrender. Okay? In Jesus' name, amen.
We hope that you enjoyed today's message. If you did, please be sure to give this video a thumbs up, maybe share it with a friend. And if you want to know more about our church, then please feel free to check out our Instagram or our website in the description below. We hope you have a blessed week. God bless.